Let's be honest, because that's the way he would have wanted it. At some point or other over the years, not just Morley, not just Ed, many people in this room were not speaking to my father. Maybe he poached one of your stories, maybe one of his needling remarks hit a little too close to the bone. My Mike Wallace moment came in the fall of 1997. I was working for the ABC News magazine Primetime, and I was set to do a profile of the comedian Chris Rock. I'd read the research, I prepared the questions, the crews were set up for the interview that day, but less than an hour before the shoot, word came that Rock was suddenly backing out. Why? Because 60 Minutes had suddenly decided to do a profile of Chris Rock. Well, pretty soon I realized that my worst fear had been realized. My old man had stolen the interview, and he knew he had stolen it from me. As you can imagine, we had quite a phone call, and it finally came down to me saying, I guess you're going to have to decide who's more important to you, Chris Wallace or Chris Rock. Long pause. I finally said, Mike, are you still there? He said, I'm thinking. The upshot is my father gave up the interview, but he kept it for 60 Minutes and gave it to Ed Bradley to make up for the Manuel Noriega interview, which I took as a big concession. And yet, all of us are here today mourning his death and wishing that we could have one more moment with him, even one of those moments. I've been thinking about a lot since my dad died. Why was someone who could be so exasperating, so endearing? Why did so many of us in this room love him so much? And what I've come up with is this. Yes, he could be difficult, even impossible, but I think that we all knew that deep down he had a good heart. He was a nice man. He could certainly be naughty or even bad, but he wasn't mean. One of the joys of the last few weeks has been hearing so many stories I didn't know of my father's acts of kindness. Bringing in journalism students who'd just written him a letter to give them career advice, reaching out to strangers brought low by depression to give them some hope. Growing up as Mike Wallace's son was not easy, and some of the qualities that made him a great reporter made him a pain in the neck at home. Before I went off to college each year, I used to have to make a presentation to him about how much money I would need for expenses. We both knew he was going to give me the money, but he wanted to put me to the test. And as someone once said, he had an underdeveloped sense of other people's privacy. Can you imagine coming home from a date and Mike Wallace is waiting up for you? Where did you go, he asked. What did you do? How do you explain this hidden camera video? I'm going to channel my inner Mike Wallace for a moment, tap my DNA, because I want to set the record straight on a couple of points, forgive me, as he would say, that have been made today. First of all this foolishness about my father being riddled with insecurity because he had acne as a young man. That may have been true in 1935. But for the last 40 years, he was a star, and he knew it. I can't tell you how many women, for some crazy reason, felt the need to inform me, his son, how sexy my father was and how they had a secret crush on him. Some of those women are in this room today. You know who you are. I've also heard a lot of commentary since my father's death about what a great performer he was, what a great interviewer. Yes, he was both, but he was much, much more than that. He was the best journalist I have ever known. This is a man who started reporting on the civil rights movement back in the 50s when he went to Little Rock to sit down with Arkansas Governor Orville Forbes. In 1959, he did a groundbreaking documentary called The Hate That Hate Produced before most people knew who the black Muslims even were. He introduced me to Malcolm X when I was 16, and I'm delighted to say that Malcolm's eldest daughter, Ambassador Shabazz, is here today with us. This is a man who started covering the Middle East during the Six-Day War in 1967 and never stopped. He started confronting the Shah of Iran about his repressive regime in 1974. He didn't just walk into the famous interview with the Ayatollah Khomeini. He had earned it through years of solid, serious reporting. Some of you know that it took a long time for my father and me to find our way to each other. He was busy pursuing his career, and I spent my early years trying to get out from his shadow. We always loved each other, but there was an underlying tension. The turning point came almost 20 years ago. My other dad, another CBS News giant, Bill Leonard, died, and my first marriage broke up. I think my father always felt that he was somehow excess baggage while Bill was around, and if there was one thing my father knew about, it was divorce. In any case, for months, while Mike was traveling the world for 60 Minutes and I was doing the same for primetime, he would track me down every night, and give me a call just to ask how I was doing, and that's when we really became father and son. About 20 years ago, he was sitting on the porch of his home in Martha's Vineyard, and my father said, one of the blessings of having such a long life is that he had time, and I remember exactly how he put it, that he had time to make amends. He knew he had broken some crockery along the way, had hurt some feelings, and he wanted to make up for it. He reached out to members of his family, and I know he reached out and reconciled with many of you. Maybe the best thing he ever did, more meaningful than any investigation or any interview, is back in 2000, he fixed up his grandson, Peter, with Morley's producer, Jennifer Braheny. By the way, he wanted to chaperone the date, but luckily he was called away at the last minute to interview Milosevic. Peter and Jen have been married now for almost 8 years, and they gave Mike 3 great-grandchildren who you saw walk in here. 2 of them are still here, whom he adored, William, Caroline, and James. The last few years weren't easy for my father. This man with such a keen intellect and such a quick mind began to slip. But as your faculties are stripped away, doctors say that what's left is the essential person. And what remained of Mike Wallace was a sweet and gentle man. The last time I saw him, I took the train up to New Canaan with my daughter Megan to introduce him to his other great-grandchild, Sabine. At the end of a wonderful visit, I told him I loved him very much. Again, there was that long pause, and I said, Grandpa, this is the point where you're supposed to tell me you love me. And he dutifully said, I love you too. I remember walking down the hall and turning back to see his silhouette against a window and wondering if I would ever see him again. I never did. But we had one last great conversation. Lorraine and I were on vacation in Florida a few weeks ago, and the phone rang, and it was Mike. It was as if the sun were shining and the birds were chirping, and he was his old self. He was funny and engaged, and he sounded great. He knew something was happening to him, but I used to tell him, you could still make a lot of money doing commercial voiceovers. And we both laughed. Even in his diminished state, there was no one who was more fun to be around. He was still Mike Wallace, and that was still plenty. On behalf of his beloved Mary, my sister Pauline, our brothers Yates, all the grandchildren, and yes, the 4 great-grandchildren, I want to thank you all for coming today to pay tribute to my dad, for all the bumps in the road. He loved you, and he knew you loved him, and that has made these last few weeks a little easier. So long.